The October rain drummed against the windows of Miller's coffee shop in downtown Portland, Oregon, creating a steady rhythm that usually helped me focus on my laptop. At 31, I'd grown accustomed to working from coffee shops, the ambient noise somehow made the silence of my apartment feel less suffocating. But today, the familiar comfort was shattered by a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. "I can't believe how well the reunion went last weekend," a woman's voice carried from the table behind me. "Your mom really outdid herself with the planning." My fingers froze over the keyboard. Reunion? My heart began to race as I strained to listen without appearing obvious. "Yeah, Linda always was the organizer of the family," came the reply. Though I was surprised David wasn't there. "Isn't he our youngest?" "David, that's me. David Chun Morrison, the product of my mother Linda's second marriage to my Chinese-American stepfather Robert. The man who raised me from age 7 but whose last name I'd hyphenated with my birth father's as an adulthood decision that had caused its own family tension." "Oh, Linda said it was better he didn't come," the first woman continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Something about not wanting to complicate things. You know how family dynamics can be." The coffee in my mouth turned bitter. My mother had organized a family reunion without me. The weight of exclusion settled in my chest like a physical ache. I closed my laptop with trembling hands and walked out into the Portland drizzle, not caring that I was getting soaked. The drive to my mother's house in Lake Oswego took 25 minutes through traffic that seemed deliberately slow, giving me too much time to think. The neighborhood hadn't changed since my teenage years, perfectly manicured lawns, houses that whispered success, the kind of place where secrets were kept behind closed doors and pleasant facades. Mom's house sat at the end of Maple Grove Lane, a 2-story colonial with the garden she'd spent decades perfecting. Even in October, her roses still bloomed defiantly against the coming winter. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the warm light spill from her kitchen window, trying to find the right words for a conversation I'd never imagined having. The doorbell's chime was the same melody I'd heard throughout my childhood. When the door opened, my mother's face lit up with genuine surprise and what looked like guilt. "David, what a lovely surprise." Linda Morrison stood in the doorway wearing her signature cardigan today, a soft blue that brought out her eyes. At 63, she still carried herself with the poise that had made her successful in real estate. "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The house smelled like vanilla candles and the faint lingering scent of her weekend baking. Family photos lined the hallway, graduations, weddings, holidays. I noticed with fresh eyes how few included me in recent years. "Is everything all right? You look upset." Her concern seemed genuine, which somehow made everything worse. "I heard about the reunion, Mom." The color drained from her face. She closed the door carefully, as if buying time to construct her response. "Oh, how did you... Does it matter how I found out?" I followed her into the living room, where evidence of the gathering still remained, extra chairs stacked in the corner, a few forgotten coffee cups on the side table. "The question is why I wasn't invited to my own family's reunion." She perched on the edge of her favorite armchair, hands folded in her lap, a gesture I recognized from childhood, usually preceding difficult conversations. "David, honey, it wasn't meant to hurt you." "Then what was it meant to do?" The silence stretched between us, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Robert had bought for their 10th anniversary. I studied my mother's face, searching for the woman who had read me bedtime stories and cheered at my soccer games, trying to reconcile her with someone who could exclude her own son. "It was better this way," she finally said, the exact words I'd overheard at the coffee shop. "Better for who?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "Because it sure as hell wasn't better for me." "Language, David, don't." I held up a hand. "Don't deflect with etiquette lessons. I'm 31 years old, and I just found out my own mother organized a family gathering without telling me. I think profanity is the least of our concerns." She stood and walked to the window, her back to me. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the street into a watercolor painting. "There are things you don't understand." complicated family matters that go back years, then explain them to me. I moved closer, close enough to see her reflection in the window, the way her jaw was set, the slight tremor in her hands. I'm tired of being treated like a child who can't handle the truth. Some truths are better left buried. The words hung in the air like a confession. For the first time, I realized this wasn't about oversight or even deliberate exclusion. This was about protection, but protection from what? Who was there? I asked quietly. She turned back to me, and I saw something I'd never seen in my mother's eyes before: fear. Your Aunt Sarah and Uncle Mike, your cousins Jenny and Tom, Roberts, Sister Catherine and her family. What about Dad? I asked, referring to my biological father, James Morrison, who'd remained friendly with the family despite the divorce. The pause was answer enough. He was there, wasn't he? David, he was there, and you didn't want me to see him. Or you didn't want him to see me. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways I didn't like. What are you telling me, Mom? She returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 63 years. Your father, James, he's been asking questions lately about you. About things that happened when you were young. What kind of questions? Questions that could hurt people. Questions that could change how you see your family, your childhood. Questions that are better left alone. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in with the weight of unnamed secrets. I thought about my childhood, searching for gaps or inconsistencies I might have missed. There had always been tension between my parents after the divorce, but I'd attributed it to typical post-divorce awkwardness. What did he do, Mom? What did my father do that was so terrible you couldn't let me be in the same room with him? It's not what he did, she whispered. It's what he knows. The grandfather clock chimed 6 o'clock, the sound echoing through the house like a countdown. I realized that my mother's careful orchestration of my absence wasn't about protecting the family from me, it was about protecting me from something I didn't even know existed. I need you to tell me the truth, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. All of it. Whatever you've been hiding, whatever you think you're protecting me from, I have the right to know. My mother looked at me with eyes full of a pain I was only beginning to understand. Oh, David, you have no idea what you're asking for, but I did know. For the first time in my life, I was asking for the truth, regardless of the consequences. And something told me that once I heard it, there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance I'd been living in. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and in that sound, I heard the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my family. I didn't sleep that night. After leaving my mother's house with more questions than answers, I'd driven aimlessly through Portland's rain-soaked streets before ending up at my apartment in the Pearl District. The loft space felt emptier than usual, filled with the echo of my mother's words, "It's what he knows." By morning, the rain had stopped, but gray clouds still hung low over the city skyline visible from my windows. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to focus on work, but the cursor blinked mockingly at me from my computer screen. How could I write marketing copy for sustainable furniture when my entire family history might be a lie? At 10:30, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. David, it's your father. We need to talk. Can you meet me at Pioneer Courthouse Square at noon? It's important, James Morrison. I hadn't spoken to my biological father in over 6 months, and before that, our conversations had been limited to awkward holiday phone calls and the occasional birthday dinner. He'd never been absent from my life entirely, but he'd never been fully present either, a peripheral figure who sent checks for college and congratulations cards for promotions. Now, 12 hours after my confrontation with Mom, he was reaching
out.
The timing couldn't be coincidental. Pioneer Courthouse Square buzzed with its usual midday energy food trucks, street musicians, and the diverse crowd of downtown Portland moving through their lunch routines. I spotted my father immediately, sitting on the steps near the coffee cart, looking older than I remembered. At 58, James Morrison still had the lean build of the runner he'd been in college, but his dark hair was now more gray than black, and deep lines creased his face. David. He stood as I approached, uncertainty flickering across his features. We'd never been huggers, settling instead for the awkward handshake that defined most of our interactions. Dad, The word felt strange after yesterday's revelations. How did you get my number? Your cousin Jenny. He gestured to a nearby bench. She gave it to me at the reunion. Said she thought it was time we talked. So Jenny had noticed my absence. That was something, at least. What did you want to discuss? We sat, watching the lunch crowd flow around us. Street musicians played jazz standards while the Max Light Rail announced its arrivals with electronic chimes. The normalcy of it all felt surreal given the circumstances. Your mother told you about the reunion, he said. It wasn't a question. She told me it was better this way. Care to explain what that means? James was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the city noise. How much do you remember about why your mother and I divorced? You grew apart, wanted different things. The usual reasons people give. I recited the explanation I'd been given as a 7-year-old. A sanitized version that had satisfied a child's questions. That's what we told you. He looked at me directly. For the first time since I'd arrived. The truth is more complicated. A chill ran down my spine despite the mild October weather. I'm listening. Your mother had an affair. The words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever I'd been expecting, it wasn't this. What? It started when you were about 5. With Robert Chun, actually, before he became your stepfather. James's voice was steady now, as if he'd practiced this confession. I found out when you were 6. The divorce followed shortly after. I stared at him, trying to process this information. My mother, Linda Morrison, pillar of the community, real estate. Agent of the Year 3 times running, had cheated on my father with the man who would later raise me. But that doesn't explain, I started. There's more. He cut me off gently. During the divorce proceedings, things got ugly. Your mother was terrified she'd lose custody because of the affair, so she made accusations. What kind of accusations? The jazz music from the street musicians seemed to fade into the background. James rubbed his temples as if the memory caused him physical pain. She claimed I had been inappropriate with you. Nothing that could be proven, but enough to make the court question my fitness as a father. Enough to ensure she got primary custody and I got supervised visitation that eventually became this. He gestured vaguely at the space between us. The world tilted. I gripped the edge of the bench, trying to anchor myself to something solid. She accused you of abusing me? The accusations were investigated? Child Services interviewed you, but you were so young, and there was never any evidence because there was nothing to find. But the damage was done. I became the father who might have hurt his son, and your mother became the protective parent keeping you safe. I thought about my childhood, searching for memories of fear or discomfort around my father. Instead, I remembered. Fishing trips, teaching me to ride a bike, bedtime stories about dragons and knights. Then, gradually, less frequent visits, more awkward interactions until our relationship had settled into its current distant politeness. Why didn't you fight? Harder? The question came out more accusatory than I'd intended. I did fight. For 3 years, I fought. But every time I pushed for more time with you, your mother would remind the court about her concerns, and you were thriving with Robert, settling into a new normal. Eventually, I realized that fighting was hurting you more than helping you. So, you just pave up? Pain flashed across his face. I chose to love you from a distance rather than put you through a custody battle that could have traumatized you further. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe I was a coward. But I was 28 years old and terrified of losing you completely. The street musicians had moved on, leaving us in relative quiet. I watched a young father help his toddler feed pigeons near the fountain, their easy interaction a stark contrast to the careful distance that had always existed between my dad and me. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying. The world stopped, literally stopped. The sounds of the city, the movement of people, even my own heartbeat seemed to pause in that moment. What? Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors. Give me 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm lucky. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. And I realized that I've spent 24 years being the absent father to protect you from painful truths. But you're not a child anymore, and I'm running out of time to tell you who I really am. I couldn't speak. The bench, the square, the entire city of Portland seemed to be spinning around me while I remained perfectly still. At the reunion, he continued, your Aunt Sarah asked why you weren't there. When your mother gave her usual excuse about family complications, Sarah said, something that stuck with me. She said, that boy has a right to know his own family. And she was right. Does she know about the accusations? No, no one knows except your mother, Robert, and the lawyers. And now you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. These are copies of the court records, the child services reports, everything. I thought you should have them. I took the envelope with numb fingers. It was heavier than I'd expected, weighted with 24 years of hidden history. David, I need you to understand something. James turned to face me fully. I never blamed you for believing what you were told. You were a child. But I also never stopped being your father, even when I couldn't act like one. The tears came without warning, years of confusion and distance suddenly making terrible sense. I thought about all the times I'd felt like an outsider in my own family. All the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, all the careful explanations that never quite explained enough.
I'm sorry, I whispered. You have nothing to be sorry for.
I should have known. I should have questioned. You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how. We all were.
He stood slowly, as if the conversation had aged him.
But now, the question is, what are you going to do with the truth? I looked up at him, this man who had been relegated to the margins of my life by accusations that were never proven, never even really investigated beyond the cursory requirements of a bitter divorce. For the first time in decades, I saw him clearly not as the distant father figure I'd grown accustomed to, but as a man who had lost his son to a lie and had been too honorable to destroy a child's family in order to get him back. I don't know, I said honestly. That's okay, but David. I hope you'll think about it. I hope you'll decide whether you want to spend whatever time I have left being strangers, or if you want to try being father and son. He walked away then, leaving me alone. On the bench with an envelope full of secrets and a truth that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The city moved around me, oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just been rebuilt from the ground up. I sat there until the afternoon shadows grew long, holding the weight of revelation in my hands and wondering if my mother was right. If some truths really were better left buried. 3 days passed before I found the courage to open the envelope. 3 days of carrying it with me everywhere, setting it on my kitchen counter during meals, placing it on my nightstand before sleep. The manila folder had become a physical presence in my apartment, impossible to ignore but too terrifying to examine. On Thursday morning, I finally spread the contents across my dining table. Court documents, child services reports, custody agreements, and a timeline that painted a picture of my childhood I barely recognized. The clinical language of legal proceedings couldn't mask the emotional devastation contained within those pages. The child services report was the hardest to read. It contained interviews with me from age 7, conducted by social workers whose names I didn't remember. My answers were documented in careful professional language. Subject shows no signs of physical abuse. No behavioral indicators consistent with trauma. Child appears well-adjusted and demonstrates normal attachment to both parents. But then came my mother's statements. Carefully crafted accusations that painted my father as manipulative and potentially dangerous. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough doubt to poison every interaction afterward. I was still staring at the papers when my phone rang. David? My cousin Jenny's voice was tentative. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number. From Uncle James? Hi, Jenny. I hadn't spoken to my cousin in months, despite living in the same city. She was 33, a nurse at OHSU, and one of the few family members who had consistently tried to maintain contact with me over the years. I wanted to apologize for the reunion. I didn't know Mom hadn't invited you until after it was over. I kept asking where you were, and the answers I got were weird. What kind of answers? Aunt Linda said you were busy with work. But when I pressed, she got uncomfortable and changed the subject. Then Uncle Robert made some comment about family dynamics being complicated. It felt like everyone knew something I didn't. I closed my eyes, imagining the scene: my family gathered in my mother's backyard, carefully avoiding the topic of my absence while everyone pretended it was normal. Jenny, can I ask you something? Growing up, did you ever notice anything strange about how Dad James interacted with me? Strange how? I don't know, inappropriate, uncomfortable, anything that seemed off. There was a long pause. David, what's this about? Just answer the question, please. No, she said firmly. Uncle James was always great with all of us kids. He taught me to drive when Dad was deployed overseas, remember? He was the one who stayed up all night with me in the ER when I broke my arm at your 10th birthday party. Why would you even ask that? Because my mother accused him of molesting me, I thought but didn't say. It's complicated. Everything's complicated in this family lately. Her voice carried frustration. Ever since the divorce, it's like there are two separate families that happen to share DNA, and you've gotten caught in the middle somehow. What do you mean? You know what I mean? You're always the afterthought, the one who gets invited last or not at all. Like your family, but not quite family. I've never understood it. Her words confirmed what I'd suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. I wasn't paranoid or oversensitive. My exclusion from family events was real and deliberate. Jenny, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise you won't repeat it to anyone else in the family. Not yet. You're scaring me. Promise me. Okay, I promise. I told her everything: my father's diagnosis, the accusations, the court records, the 24 years of carefully maintained distance based on lies. She listened without interrupting, her breath occasionally catching over the phone. Oh my God, she whispered when I finished. Oh, David, this explains so much.
Does
it? The way Aunt Linda always changes the subject when Uncle James is mentioned. The way she tenses up whenever you talk about wanting to spend more time with him. I always thought she was just being protective of your relationship with Uncle Robert. I need to confront her, but I don't know how. What do you say to someone who stole your relationship with your father based on lies? You tell her the truth. You tell her you know. That evening I drove to my mother's house again, but this time, I wasn't the confused son seeking answers. I was an adult demanding accountability. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, its contents having transformed my understanding of everything. The October air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. My mother's house looked the same as always: welcoming, perfectly maintained, a picture of suburban tranquility. But now I saw it differently, wondering how many other secrets were hidden behind its cheerful facade. Robert answered the door. My stepfather looked surprised to see me, glancing back toward the kitchen with an expression I couldn't quite read. David, we weren't expecting you. I need to talk to Mom. She's in the kitchen. Is everything all right? I walked past him without answering, following the sound of running water and the clink of dishes. My mother stood at the sink, her back to me, washing dinner plates with the methodical precision she applied to everything in her life. Mom, she turned, and I saw knowledge in her eyes immediately. She knew why I was there. You talked to your father. I did. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter. And I read these. She dried her hands slowly, using the dish towel to buy time. Robert appeared in the doorway behind me, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Linda? He said quietly. What's going on? Robert, could you give us some privacy? I asked without taking my eyes off my mother. This is my house too, he replied, but his tone was more confused than defensive. It's okay, honey, my mother sighed. David and I need to talk alone. Robert hesitated, then nodded and left us in the kitchen. The silence stretched until we heard his footsteps on the stairs and the distant sound of the television turning on in their bedroom. How much did he tell you? She asked finally. Everything. The affair, the accusations, the custody battle. I pulled out one of the documents. I have the court records, Mom. I know what you said about him.
Her composure cracked for just a moment, and I saw the fear I'd glimpsed 3 days earlier.
But then she straightened, lifting her chin in the gesture of defiance I remembered from my childhood. I was protecting you. From what? From having a relationship with my father? From being hurt by him?
He never hurt me.
The words came out louder then.
I'd intended.
You know he never hurt me. The reports prove it. Even as a 7-year-old, I told the social workers there was nothing wrong. Children don't always understand. Stop. I held up my hand. Just stop. I'm not a child anymore, and I won't let. You treat me like one. You made false accusations against my father to win a custody battle. And then you spent 24 years maintaining that lie to justify keeping us apart. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly looking fragile. It wasn't supposed to go on this long. What does that mean? The accusations... I was desperate, David. James was going to fight for 50-50 custody, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you half the time. Robert and I were planning to get married, and I wanted us to be a family. A complete family. So you destroyed my relationship with my biological father to create your perfect blended family?
I thought
it would be better for you. Robert loved you like his own son from the beginning. You were thriving. You seemed happy. I was 7 years old. Of course I adapted. Children adapt to survive. I began pacing the small kitchen, energy and anger coursing through me. But I had a right to know my father. I had a right to have a relationship with him that wasn't poisoned by your lies. They weren't lies, she said quietly. I stopped pacing. What? I said they weren't lies. She looked up at me with eyes that held secrets I was only beginning to uncover. I never actually believed James had hurt you. But I convinced myself that he might, that the potential was there. That removing him from your life was the safer choice. That's the same thing as lying, is it? I don't know anymore. She rubbed her temples. I've spent so many years justifying my choices that I'm not sure I remember what the truth actually is. The admission hung between us like a confession. This was the closest my mother had ever come to acknowledging the damage she'd caused. And, it wasn't nearly enough. He's dying, Mom. The color drained from her face. What? Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8. And instead of spending his final months getting to know his son, he's using them to clean up the mess you made of our relationship. She began to cry, then silent tears that carved tracks down her cheeks. For a moment, I felt the old instinct to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But I wasn't a child anymore, and some hurts were too deep for easy forgiveness. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know you are. But sorry doesn't give me back 24 years with my father. Sorry doesn't undo the damage. What do you want from me? The question was simple, but the answer was complex. What did I want? An apology, acknowledgement. Some way to reclaim the relationship that had been stolen from me. I want you to tell the family the truth. All of them. I want you to explain why you've kept me at arm's length for years. Why family gatherings became uncomfortable whenever my father was mentioned. Why I always felt like an outsider in my own family. David, and I want you to call him. I want you to apologize to James Morrison for what you did to both of us. She was quiet for a long time, tears still falling silently. Outside, I could hear Robert moving around upstairs, probably wondering what crisis was unfolding in his kitchen. If I do that, she said finally, everything changes. Our family, the way people see me, the way Robert might see me. Everything I've built could fall apart. Everything you built was constructed on a lie, Mom. Maybe it's time to see what's left when you strip away the deception. She looked at me then with something approaching recognition, as if she were seeing me clearly. For the first time in years. Not as the child she needed to protect or control, but as an adult capable of handling difficult truths. You're right, she said simply. The admission surprised me. I'd expected more argument, more justification, more of the defensive responses. That had characterized our relationship for as long as I could remember. I am? You're right, about all of it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I made choices based on fear and selfishness, and I convinced myself they were about protecting you. But they were about protecting me. About having the family I wanted, regardless of the cost to anyone else. I sat down across from her, the anger that had sustained me through the confrontation beginning to ebb. So what happens now? Now I try to fix what I broke, if it's not too late. She reached across the table, hesitating before touching my hand. Will you help me? For the first time in 3 days, I felt something like hope. The road ahead would be difficult, rebuilding trust, reconnecting with my father, healing family. Wounds that had festered for decades. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I might actually belong to my family. Not despite the complications, but because we were finally facing them honestly. Yes, I said. I'll help you. 2 weeks later, I found myself in an unfamiliar position, sitting in my father's cramped but meticulously organized apartment in southeast Portland, helping him sort through 24 years' worth of memories he'd been afraid to share. The afternoon sun filtered through dust motes that danced in the air between us like tiny spirits, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as we navigated this delicate terrain of rediscovery. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with possibility, charged with the weight of everything we'd never said, and everything we were finally beginning to understand. About each other. The drive over had been nerve-wracking. I'd sat in my car outside his building for nearly 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to summon the courage to walk up those 3 flights of stairs. This was only our 4th meeting since the diagnosis, and each one had felt like stepping onto a frozen lake, never quite sure if the ice would hold or if we'd both come crashing through into the frigid water of our shared past. James lived in a converted warehouse in the Hawthorne district, a space that reflected his personality in ways I was only beginning to understand and appreciate. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside: red brick worn smooth by decades of Portland rain, windows that had been retrofitted into the original industrial framework, a small garden courtyard that the residents maintained collectively. But his 3rd-floor unit was a revelation. The exposed brick walls and soaring ceilings gave the place an industrial feel that could have been cold and imposing. But he'd softened it with warm lighting and carefully chosen furniture that spoke to a man who valued comfort and function over style or status. A worn leather armchair sat angled toward the windows, positioned to catch the morning light, clearly his reading spot. The coffee table beside it was stacked with books, all of them bookmarked at various points with scraps of paper. Covered in his careful handwriting, the walls were lined floor to ceiling with custom-built bookshelves that spoke to his engineering background, precise, functional, beautiful in their simplicity. They were filled with histories and biographies, their spines worn from repeated reading, organized by subject and then alphabetically within each category. Military history occupied 2 full shelves, along with biographies of architects and engineers, books about urban planning and sustainable design. But interspersed among these professional interests were surprises: poetry collections, philosophy texts, even a few novels that looked like they'd been read multiple times, and scattered throughout, tucked between books and mounted on small easels, were photographs I'd never seen, pictures of me from school events he'd attended from a distance, newspaper clippings of my college graduation and my first job promotion yellowed with age and carefully preserved behind glass, certificates of achievement I'd forgotten I'd even received, programs from school plays and concerts with my name highlighted in careful strokes of yellow marker. It was overwhelming evidence of a father who had been present in my life even when I didn't know it, watching and caring from the shadows, documenting my growth like a devoted biographer chronicling the life of someone he deeply admired but could only observe from afar. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books, with undertones of lemon oil from the wood polish he used on his furniture, and beneath it all, the medicinal odor that seemed to follow him everywhere, now the sharp chemical scent of prescription drugs and illness. A stack of medical journals sat on his kitchen counter next to pill bottles arranged in precise rows by day and time. Daily reminders of the pancreatic cancer that had brought us back together. The kitchen was small but efficient, every utensil and appliance positioned with the precision of someone who had learned to live alone and do it well. I noticed he'd prepared for my visit. There was a thermos of coffee on the counter, still warm to the touch, and he'd arranged cookies on a plate with the careful attention to presentation that reminded me he'd once been married. had once known how to make a home for more than just himself. The gesture was small, but it touched something deep in my chest, this evidence that he'd been thinking about my comfort, anticipating my needs. "I kept hoping that someday we'd have a chance to go through these together," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of hope and disappointment, tinged with the rasp that had developed since he'd started treatment. He moved slowly, deliberately, his movements careful and measured as he pulled out a thick photo album labeled David Years 7 to 31 in his precise architect's handwriting. The label itself made my chest tight, the formality of it, the way he documented my life like a research project because he hadn't been allowed to live it with me. The date range was particularly poignant, starting from when I was 7, when the custody arrangement had been finalized, ending at 31, my current age. As if he'd been waiting for this exact moment to close the chapter on observing my life from a distance. "I probably should have thrown them away, moved on like everyone told me to," he continued, settling carefully into his chair with the album balanced on his lap. "My therapist said I was torturing myself, that holding on to these memories was preventing me from building a new life. My lawyer said it looked obsessive, that if your mother ever found out how closely I'd been following your life, it could be used against me. But I couldn't let go of the idea that you might want to know how proud I was, even from afar. Even when it seemed completely hopeless, even when years would go by without so much as a phone call." The album was bound in deep green leather, obviously. Expensive, the kind of thing you buy when you want something to last generations. The cover was slightly worn at the corners where his hands had gripped it over the years, and there were small water stains on the bottom edge, evidence of tears, perhaps, or just the humidity of Portland winters. As he opened it, the binding creaked slightly, a sound like old floorboards settling, releasing the scent of old photographs and preservation materials, that distinctive smell of carefully maintained memories. The album was a revelation that hit me like a physical blow. The first page contained photos of me playing Little League baseball, but these weren't the casual snapshots a parent might take from the bleachers. These were taken from the parking lot beyond the chain-link fence, shot through the diamond pattern of the mesh with a telephoto lens, the photographer clearly trying to get as close as possible while maintaining his distance. I could see his car in the reflection of one photo, a blue sedan parked as far away as he could manage, while still having a clear view of the field. There were dozens of photos from those games, tracking my progression from a tentative 7-year-old who was afraid of the ball to a confident 12-year-old who had learned to swing with authority. He'd captured my first hit, my first stolen base. Even the game where I struck out 3 times and cried on the bench afterward. In that last photo, taken from so far away that I was barely recognizable, you could still see the slump of my small shoulders. The way I wiped my eyes with my uniform sleeve. My high school graduation was documented from multiple angles, all of them from the very back row of the auditorium where he'd stood against the wall, too far away to see my face clearly, but close enough to witness the moment when I walked across that stage. He'd somehow managed to capture the exact second when I received my diploma, the flash creating a small burst of light that illuminated my proud smile. There were photos of me with my friends afterward, taken from across the parking lot as we posed for pictures with our families that I now realized he hadn't been invited to join. Even my college orientation day was there, captured through the window of the student union as he helped me move into my dorm, one of the few times we'd spent together during those years. And even then, under the watchful eye of my mother's suspicion. I remembered that day differently than the photographs suggested. I thought he seemed distracted, uninterested in the details of my new life. But the photos told a different story. They showed a man trying to memorize every detail,
taking mental photographs to sustain him through another long separation. Each image was accompanied by notes in his precise handwriting.
The kind of careful documentation that spoke to his professional training but also to the deep love of a father, trying to preserve every scrap of connection to his son. The notes were detailed, personal, filled with observations that only someone who truly cared would think to record. David's first home run. 5th grade, coach said he has natural talent. Reminds me of myself at that age. Dean's List again. Third semester, so proud of his dedication, his work ethic. Starting his first real job today, wore the tie I gave him for graduation. Hope it brings him luck. Some entries were longer, almost like diary entries. Watch David play the lead in the school production of Our Town. He was magnificent, so confident on stage, so comfortable in his own skin. I wanted to stand up and cheer, to tell everyone in that auditorium that this brilliant young man was my son. Instead, I sat in the back and applauded until my hands hurt. And when it was over, I had to sit in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home. There were ticket stubs taped to the pages from school plays I'd been in, concerts where I'd performed violin solos, even sporting events where he'd somehow managed to get close enough to attend. Each stub was dated and annotated, David's. First violin recital, played batch beautifully, only missed 2 notes. State championship game, David scored twice, team won 3-1, he was so happy. Some photos were blurry, taken from too far away or in poor lighting conditions, but he'd kept them all. There were images where I was barely visible, just a small figure among dozens of other kids, but he'd circled me in pencil and written David, with an arrow, as if he were afraid of forgetting which child was his. The thoroughness of it was both touching and heartbreaking. This man had attended my life like a devoted scholar studying a subject he was passionate about but could never fully access. There were photos I had no memory of him taking, moments when I had been completely unaware of his presence. A shot of me reading alone during lunch in high school, taken from outside the cafeteria window. Pictures of me working at my first job, captured through the front window of the bookstore where I worked weekends during college. Even photos of me with girlfriends, walking across campus or sitting in coffee shops, images that must have required him to follow me. To know my schedule and my habits, the invasion of privacy should have felt creepy, but instead it felt like love, the desperate love of a parent who had been cut off from his child's life but refused to let go completely. Every photo was evidence of his commitment to knowing me, even from a distance, even when that distance must have felt like torture. You were there, I said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper, more to myself than to him. The realization was settling over me like a heavy blanket, all those years when I had felt abandoned, when I'd convinced myself he didn't care, when I'd created elaborate fantasies about why he'd chosen to stay away. He'd been there, just outside. The frame of my awareness, watching and caring and documenting my growth with the devotion of someone who had never stopped being my father, even when he wasn't allowed to act like one. I was always there, David, just ... a distance. Always at that goddamn distance. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he cleared his throat, turning the page to avoid my eyes. The next section contained photos from my college years, and I could see how his photography had improved over time, how he'd invested in better equipment, learned to work with low light and long distances. Your mother made sure of that, but I made sure I didn't miss anything I could possibly witness. I may not have been in your life, but I was never absent from it. The college photos were particularly poignant because they captured a version of myself I'd forgotten young, idealistic, full of possibility. There were shots of me studying in the library, working at my campus job, even drunk at parties where I thought no parent would ever see me. But there he was, somehow, capturing these moments of my emerging adulthood from whatever vantage point he could find. How did you even know where to find me? I asked, fascinated despite myself by the logistics of this elaborate surveillance. I had your class schedules, he admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. Your mother's sister Sarah felt bad about the situation. She'd slip me information, sometimes not much, but enough. When you got your first apartment, when you changed jobs, when you were dating someone seriously. She thought it was cruel, keeping a father away from his son completely. I remembered Aunt Sarah differently after that, remembered the way she'd always ask detailed questions about my life at family gatherings, the way she'd seem to listen extra carefully to my answers. I thought she was just being polite, but now I realized she'd been gathering intelligence to pass along to my father, since my confrontation with my mother 2 weeks earlier. Our fractured family had entered a period of careful reconstruction that felt both promising and precarious. like a building damaged in an earthquake being slowly, carefully shored up with new supports. True to her word, Mom had called a family meeting the previous weekend, this time including me, which was itself a small miracle that had required her to swallow years of pride and admit she'd been wrong. The meeting had taken place in the formal dining room that was only used for holidays and special occasions, as if the gravity of the situation demanded the family's best china and most uncomfortable chairs. She'd sat at the head of the long table, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her, wearing the navy blue dress she reserved for funerals and other solemn occasions. Her hands shook slightly as she'd methodically dismantled 24 years of carefully constructed lies. She'd started with the accusations themselves, explaining in clinical detail how the investigation had unfolded, how Child Protective Services had cleared James completely, how the court had found no evidence of any wrongdoing. She'd talked about her fears as a young mother, her own childhood trauma that had made her paranoid about leaving me alone with any man, even my own father. She'd explained how the custody battle had escalated, how lawyers had gotten involved, how what started as her trying to protect me had evolved into something much darker and more destructive. I convinced myself I was protecting David, she'd sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. But somewhere along the way, protecting him became controlling him, and controlling him became controlling all of you. I made you all complicit in keeping a good man away from his son, and I will never forgive myself for that. The reactions around that table had been mixed and intense, like watching a controlled explosion that revealed the hidden structure of our family's dynamics. Aunt Sarah had cried openly, her hand pressed to her mouth as she whispered, "I can't believe this," over and over. She'd known more than the others, had been the one secretly feeding information to my father, but hearing the full scope of the deception had clearly overwhelmed her. My cousin Jenny, who'd always been like a sister to me, had reacted with pure anger, her face flushing red as she'd slammed her hand on the table. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she'd demanded. David spent his entire childhood thinking his father didn't want him. Do you understand how that shapes a person? Her fury had been protective, loyal, but it had also been personal. She'd been lied to as well, had spent years believing her uncle was some kind of monster. The uncomfortable, heavy silence had come from Robert, my stepfather, who was still processing the revelation that his marriage had been built partly on his wife's lies and manipulation. He'd sat at the opposite end of the table from my mother, his face cycling through confusion, hurt, and something that looked like relief. I wondered if he'd always suspected something wasn't quite right about the story, if he'd spent years trying to reconcile the man he occasionally encountered at family events, quiet, sad, but clearly harmless, with the monster my mother had described. Uncle Mike had simply stared at his hands throughout most of the meeting, occasionally glancing up at me with something that looked like guilt. Later, I would learn that he'd been the one to discourage my mother from letting me have any contact with James, that his own divorce had made him suspicious of all fathers and protective of his sister's choices, but there had also been something like relief in the room, palpable and almost breathable, as if a pressure valve had finally been released after years of building tension. The unspoken questions that had hung over every family gathering, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the way conversations died when James's name came up accidentally, it all finally made sense. The elephant in the room had been acknowledged, named, and in naming it, we'd begun the process of figuring out how to live with the truth. "How are you feeling about all of this?" I asked my father, gently closing the photo album and setting it carefully on the coffee table between us. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its actual mass, as if it contained more than just photographs, as if it held the concentrated essence of all our lost years, all the moments that should have been shared but were instead observed. From a distance, he was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful deliberation I was learning was characteristic of him. Everything he did was measured, thoughtful, the product of a man who'd learned that words and actions have consequences that can last decades, that one wrong move could result in years more separation. The afternoon light streaming through his tall windows highlighted the gauntness that had become more pronounced since his pancreatic cancer diagnosis.
casting sharp shadows across his cheekbones and making his hands look almost skeletal as they rested on his knees.
But his eyes, those eyes that were so like mine, the same unusual shade of green gold that had made strangers comment on our resemblance. When I was young, were clearer and more present than I'd seen them in years, as if the truth had lifted. Some invisible burden he'd been carrying. "Grateful," he said finally, the word coming out with surprising firmness, as if he'd been testing different answers in his mind and had settled on the most honest one. "And terrified." Terrified? I leaned forward slightly, genuinely curious. This was the most honest conversation we'd ever had? Possibly the most honest conversation either of us had ever had with anyone. And I didn't want to break whatever spell was allowing it to happen. I've spent so long being the peripheral father, David, the father who watches from parking lots and stands in the back of auditoriums and celebrates his son's achievements alone in his car afterward. He paused, running his hand through what remained of his graying hair, a gesture I recognized because I did the same thing when I was nervous. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. What if we try to build a real relationship and discover we don't actually like each other? What if 24 years of distance and resentment and missed opportunities can't be bridged in the 6 months the doctor says I have left? What if I disappoint you all over again, just in a different way this time? The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable, like watching someone expose a wound they'd been hiding for decades. I understood his fear because I shared it completely, had been lying awake at night wrestling with the same questions. The man sitting across from me in this carefully curated space was essentially a stranger who happened to share my DNA and my stubborn chin and my tendency to overthink everything. We were trying to compress decades of father-son bonding, the kind of relationship that typically builds slowly through shared experiences, daily interactions, gradual trust, countless small moments of connection, into whatever time his failing body would allow us. The pressure felt enormous, like trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, like expecting a lifetime of love to bloom in the space of a few months. "Maybe we start small," I suggested, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Inside." I felt anything but steady. I felt like I was improvising my way through the most important conversation of my life. No pressure to make up for lost time or to become the father and son we might have been in some alternate universe. Just ... get to know each other as we are now. Two adults who are related and who want to understand each other better. I'd like that very much. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face and erased years from his appearance. And for a moment I caught a glimpse of the father I might have known, the one who would have taught me to throw a curveball, and helped me with my algebra homework and been there for all the ordinary moments that build a relationship. "Tell me about your work." "David, not the elevator pitch version you give at family dinners to keep the peace and avoid awkward questions, but what you actually do. What gets you excited about getting up in the morning?" So I told him about my marketing consulting business, painting a picture that went far beyond the sanitized version I usually offered to family members, who were more interested in being polite than genuinely curious. I described the thrill of solving complex brand problems, of taking a company that was struggling to find its voice and helping them discover not just what they wanted to say, but how to say it in a way that would resonate with exactly the right audience. I talked about the satisfaction of creating campaigns that didn't just sell products but told stories, that connected with people on an emotional level. I described the clients who drove me to the edge of sanity, with their impossible demands and constantly changing minds, the CEO who wanted his pest control company to seem fun and approachable without acknowledging that most people don't want to think about bugs at all, the restaurant owner who insisted her authentic Italian food truck should appeal to everyone despite the fact that her recipes were actually Mexican fusion dishes her grandmother had adapted during the Depression. But I also talked about the projects that excited me and made me feel like I was using my creativity for something meaningful, the nonprofit that helped homeless veterans that I'd rebranded pro bono, the small organic farm that had tripled their sales after I'd helped them tell the story of their sustainable practices. the bookstore that had been struggling to compete with Amazon until we'd positioned them as a community gathering place rather than just a retail outlet. I told him about my apartment in the Pearl District, describing the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city and the small balcony where I drank my morning coffee while watching Portland wake up below me. I explained how I'd chosen the neighborhood specifically because it felt like it was constantly evolving, like I could reinvent myself there without anyone noticing or caring about who I'd been before. I talked about why I'd chosen Portland over the dozens of other cities I could have landed in after college, the way it felt like a place where you could be yourself without apology, where creativity was valued over conformity, where being slightly weird was considered an asset rather than a liability. But I also admitted how that freedom had sometimes felt overwhelming. How having so many options for who I could become had sometimes left me paralyzed about who I actually wanted to be. I told him about the novel I'd been writing for 3 years, but never seemed to finish, how it sat on my laptop like a constant reminder of my own inability to commit to anything that didn't have a clear deadline and a guaranteed paycheck. The story was about a man searching for his father, which in retrospect seemed almost painfully obvious. But at the time, I thought I was writing fiction. I described my complicated relationship with dating in careful detail, explaining how I seemed to magnetically attract women who were drowning in their own chaos. The ones with unfinished dissertations and complicated family dynamics, with credit card debt and unresolved trauma from previous relationships, with ambitious dreams that they'd never quite figured out how to pursue. These were the women who lit up when I offered to help edit their resumes or listened patiently while they processed their latest crisis at 2 a.m. But the women who had their lives figured out, the ones with stable careers and healthy boundaries, the ones who knew what they wanted and weren't afraid to ask for it. They seemed to sense something inauthentic about me from across a crowded room, as if I were broadcasting on a frequency that only attracted people who needed fixing. I talked extensively about my pattern of relationships that felt intense and meaningful for those first few months, the ones that began with late-night conversations, where we'd map out each other's psychological landscapes and promise to be completely honest with each other. These relationships would burn bright and fast, fueled by the intoxicating feeling of being truly seen and understood, of finding someone who appreciated my carefully curated vulnerability and my willingness to dive deep into emotional territory that most people avoided. But then, inevitably, they would fizzle out when the other person began to realize, sometimes consciously, sometimes just as a growing unease they couldn't name, that I was performing a highly sophisticated version of myself rather than actually being myself. They'd start to notice the calculated spontaneity, the way my seemingly effortless insights were actually the product of years of reading self-help books and psychology articles, the way my empathy, while genuine, was also partly performative, a skill I'd developed to make myself indispensable to people who were struggling, most honestly, and with a level of vulnerability that surprised even me as the words left my mouth. I told him about the way I felt simultaneously deeply connected to and profoundly alienated from the city I'd called home for the past decade. I explained how I could walk through neighborhoods where I knew every coffee shop owner's name and every shortcut between the subway stops, where I had memories attached to nearly every corner and favorite spots that I'd discovered during different phases of my life, and still feel like an outsider looking in through a window at a life that was supposed to be mine but somehow wasn't quite. I described how I'd built what anyone would recognize as a successful life, a career that was both financially stable and creatively fulfilling, an apartment in a neighborhood that my college friends envied, a social circle that included interesting people doing important work, but how it often felt hollow at the center. Like a beautifully decorated house with rooms full of expensive furniture but no foundation underneath. Beautiful to look at, but fundamentally unstable. And throughout all of this, he listened with the fierce intensity of someone making up for years of lost time. Someone who understood that this might be his only chance to really know me and was determined not to waste a single word. He asked questions that showed he'd been paying attention not just to what I was saying, but to the careful pauses between my sentences, to the way my voice changed when I talked about certain topics, to the defensive gestures I made when I felt too exposed. His insights could only have come from years of watching me from a distance and thinking deeply, almost academically, about who I was becoming and why. His questions were devastatingly specific and thoughtful, the kind that revealed he'd been preparing for this conversation not just since we'd sat down, but possibly for years. Do you think your interest in helping other people find their authentic voice, the way you're always encouraging your friends to quit jobs that don't fulfill them, or end relationships that aren't serving them, comes from having spent your formative years figuring out how to present yourself to a family that loved you but didn't quite know what to do with who you were becoming? And when you talk about your apartment, you always focus on the view outward, the way you can see the park from your kitchen window, the way the light hits the building across the street in the evening. Do you think that's because you're still unconsciously looking for an escape route, even now, even in a place you've chosen and decorated and made your own? The observations were uncomfortably perceptive, so piercingly accurate that they left me feeling exposed, as if someone had reached into the carefully guarded corners of my mind and gently, almost reverently, pulled my unspoken truths into the light. There was a sharp, involuntary tightness in my chest, the kind that comes not from fear exactly, but from the sudden weight of being seen too clearly. Not in the superficial, passing sense of someone noticing your habits or quirks, but in the deeper, more unsettling way that someone understands the forces shaping your choices, your silence, your pain. His words didn't carry judgment or pity. They carried something far more disarming: attention, empathy, and a level of insight that could only come from years of quiet observation paired with a sincere and sustained effort to understand rather than to interpret through his own lens. It was clear that this wasn't someone who had stumbled upon these truths by accident. They were the hard-earned conclusions of a person who, though held at a distance by the circumstances of life or perhaps by my own emotional barriers, had still chosen to look closely, chosen to pay attention, to notice the patterns others missed, to piece together the fragments I unconsciously scattered across interactions, conversations, and silences. He had watched without intruding, waited without pressing, and listened not just to what I said, but to everything I didn't know how to say. In that quiet persistence, he had begun to see me in ways that even I had refused to look at myself. Each question he asked was like a carefully angled mirror, not the harsh kind that exposes flaws under unforgiving light, but one that revealed the soft outlines of truths I'd been skirting around for years. These weren't new realizations, not really. They were the same half-formed thoughts I'd danced around in therapy, the vague discomforts I'd cloaked in humor during late-night conversations with friends, the emotional weight I had tried to name but never quite captured in words. But somehow, when reflected through his language so patient, so precise, they emerged fully formed, undeniable, and I found myself unable to look away. There was no space to deflect or rationalize, no well-worn narrative I could retreat into. Just the stillness of being seen, not as a performance or a puzzle to be solved, but as a whole person in all my contradictions, fears, longings, and quiet strengths. It was terrifying, that kind of visibility. But strangely, it was also a relief, because in being seen so clearly, I didn't feel reduced, I felt known. And something in me, something long curled inward in self-protection, began to loosen, just slightly, in response.